Sand always found its way into the strangest places, even the fur of a polar bear who had journeyed far from home. In the scorching summer sun of a remote tropical beach, a large, snowy white polar bear ambled around, squinting at the throngs of humans in flip-flops and sunglasses. He wasn't entirely clear on how he'd ended up there, but one thing was certain. He was really, really hot. The heat was oppressive, and he missed the cooling embrace of ice floes and chilly Arctic winds. So against every natural instinct and common sense, he had resolved to do something bold to keep his cool. He'd crash every beach party he could find. At first, he'd arrived on the sandy shore with the idea it might feel a bit like a massive dune of icy snow blinding, bright and reminiscent of home. It had taken him a few hours of wandering around to figure out this was nothing like the Arctic. The air shimmered above the sand, and the ocean waves consistently lapped at his paws with an unwelcome saltiness. Polar bears typically weren't fans of salt water tasting sessions. Back home, the water was crisp and cold, an invitation to a hearty swim among the glaciers. Here, it was warm enough to lull him to sleep if he weren't so irritated by the heat. He huffed, scanning the scene. The beach was brimming with colorful umbrellas, plastic chairs, and a kaleidoscope of beach towels. Beyond that lay the most interesting sight of all. Gatherings of people in bright swimwear, swirling punch bowls, and portable barbecues sending out savory aromas. There was music, laughter, and a sense of relaxed celebration that made the polar bear's large, sensitive ears twitch with curiosity. He inhaled the sweet coconut scent from a nearby cocktail as a wave of envy rolled through him. That's exactly what he needed, something cooling, something refreshing, and maybe a cozy spot under the shade. He recognized that, out in the open, he was quite the spectacle. He was easily double or triple the size of any average sunbather. No matter how nonchalant he tried to be, people were going to notice a massive white bear strolling by in search of ice cubes. Yet, for all the potential commotion, he couldn't leave. Not without an attempt to crash at least one of these beach get-togethers. The plan formed in his mind. He would pretend to be one of them, a partygoer. It was definitely a stretch, but hey, polar bears were known to be resourceful and desperate. And oh, so hot. He started by observing. Other partygoers wore bright floral shirts, sunglasses perched on their noses, or hats with wide brims. One man had an entire inflatable flamingo wrapped around his waist. The polar bear tried to get a sense of human fashion. Apparently, the more outrageous, the better. Maybe that would work to his advantage. If he could find something equally outlandish to wear, perhaps no one would question his presence. He padded around behind a row of beach chairs until, at last, he found a leftover pink sun hat perched on a chaise lounge. Perfect, he thought. With a surprising gentleness for a creature his size, he picked it up with his massive paw and set it squarely on his head. The hat promptly slid off, since polar bear heads aren't shaped much like humans, but he managed to hold it in place by tilting his snout upward. Next, he discovered a pair of oversized sunglasses someone had left behind. Bright neon green frames with pineapple decorations at the corners, they were absolutely gaudy, which seemed on brand given the beach attire he'd witnessed. He slipped them on, then rummaged in a pile of beach toys and found a striped towel that could function as a sort of makeshift sarong if he draped it around his torso. He examined his reflection in a shiny portable grill. With the silly hat, enormous sunglasses, and a towel draped around his hips, he resembled a truly bizarre teddy bear on vacation. He took a deep breath. Time for an entrance. The nearest beach party was filled with squawking gulls overhead, pastel balloon decorations, and a long folding table set up with snacks, ice-cold drinks, and a big bowl of fruit punch swirling with ice cubes. Just seeing the condensation on the punch bowl made the polar bear's tongue loll out. Unable to contain himself, he sidled up to the group, attempting to blend in as a regular old tourist. Perhaps if he just kept walking casually, nobody would suspect a thing. At first, nobody noticed him. They were busy dancing to some pop song playing from a portable speaker. The polar bear tried to sway a little to the music. It was awkward. His wide paws made small, tentative moves in the sand. He hoped that if he acted like he belonged, no one would question it. Several folks were turned away, focusing on their grill or their conversation. A few beachgoers were lost in a game of frisbee. The polar bear inched closer to the table. Then came the moment. The polar bear grabbed the ladle of fruit punch. He gently poured some into an enormous plastic cup, though spilling a bit was inevitable given his giant paws. He carefully slurped it, and the icy sweetness was bliss. It tasted of berries and tropical fruit with a cold that was far too short-lived for his liking, but at least it was refreshing. He closed his eyes, savoring the moment like a connoisseur. A few more slurps and the cup was empty. He refilled it. And again, another. He exhaled, feeling a pleasant chill in his belly for the first time since he'd left the far north. He was so focused on the punch that he hadn't realized everyone at the party had stopped what they were doing. The music still played, but the dancing had ceased. Conversations had died down. The entire gathering stared, frozen in place, at a polar bear in a neon hat and sunglasses, draped in a beach towel, guzzling fruit punch like it was nectar of the gods. The bear felt the collective gaze and turned slowly. A chunk of pineapple from the punch was stuck to his nose. He blinked behind his oversized sunglasses, stunned at being caught. For a moment, no one moved. The tension was thick. The polar bear resisted the urge to snatch up the entire punch bowl and bolt. Were they going to scream? Run for their lives? He braced himself. Then, out of nowhere, a hearty laugh rang out, cutting through the silence. An older woman in a flowy yellow sundress chuckled so hard she spilled her own drink. She hooted, "That is the funniest costume I've seen in years! Where'd you get that fursuit? It's so realistic!" The polar bear blinked, uncertain. Did she think he was wearing a costume? Several others started laughing as well, apparently deciding that this had to be some kind of big, elaborate joke. "Man, that's next level," said a shirtless gentleman with a lime green visor. "Those animatronic jaws are insane." The group gathered around the polar bear, patting his thick arms and nudging each other in awe of the special effects. He forced a polite toothy grin, careful to keep his enormous carnivorous teeth from scaring them straight. If playing along with the costume idea kept him in the party, so be it. The tension broken, the party resumed. Music swelled, laughter escalated, and several people offered the polar bear more punch, excited to see him drinking from a human-sized cup. He reveled in the air of acceptance, though he was still uncomfortably warm. When the dance music changed to a slow song, he found himself tugged into a group sway by enthusiastic partiers. The polar bear did his best, balancing on hind legs, swaying left and right, the flamboyant hat perched precariously on his head. He realized that, in a strange way, he was actually enjoying this. The humans were friendly, silly, and relaxed. Nobody was out to freeze him in an iceberg or chase him away. Eventually, he slipped away from the dancing to stand in front of an industrial-sized fan someone had set up by the punch table. Blissful air gusted through his fur, sending bits of sand swirling everywhere. This was heaven, or at least the best he'd found since leaving the north. He felt a wave of relief that he'd found a new strategy. Slipping into beach parties disguised as a guy in a polar bear suit was ridiculously easy, and the rewards, cold drinks, fresh fruit, the occasional air conditioning unit, were immeasurable. He daydreamed about filling up an inflatable kiddie pool with ice cubes or hooking up with a large freezer, but that might be going a bit too far, even for a bold polar bear. Reinforced by his success, he decided one party wasn't enough. He would try to sneak into as many as possible while the heat persisted. The next day, he set out bright and early, rummaging through souvenir shops under cover of dawn. Furtively, he pawed through racks of tropical shirts, flamboyant hats, and flip-flops. The flip-flops were obviously useless for his giant paws, but he did snag a pair of garish board shorts covered in cartoon fish. With no one around, he slinked out of the store. If he tried them on, maybe he would look even more authentic among the beachgoers. His second infiltration was at a birthday celebration. Brightly colored streamers waved in the breeze, and a table groaned under the weight of an elaborate cake. Children splashed in the shallows, squealing with delight. The polar bear carefully approached, doing his best to walk on two legs so he could see more upright and, at least in theory, more human-like. This time, to his horror, the first person to spot him was a child. She had bright, curious eyes, and she squealed, "A polar bear! A real polar bear!" The parents turned, alarmed, but to the polar bear's relief, they seemed uncertain about whether it was real or just someone dressed up for the kids' party. Then the child squealed again, but this time in delight rather than fear. She rushed over, arms open, chanting, "Polar bear hugs! Polar bear hugs!" The polar bear stiffened. He wasn't used to small humans launching themselves at him. Before he could react, the child wrapped her arms around his massive middle, burying her face in his fur. He stood there, stunned. For a moment, it was actually rather sweet, like having a small pup nuzzle up to him for warmth. Then she giggled, squeaking, "Fuzzy!" and ran off to brag to her friends that she'd hugged a polar bear. The grown-ups slowly relaxed. Some still appeared uneasy, but a couple of them approached and mumbled about how the costume was so good. And who hired the bear? Did you do it, Greg? Meanwhile, the polar bear eyed the cake, noticing it was decorated with a shape that looked suspiciously like an igloo. Could it be some fate-tempting coincidence? Maybe these people had a sense of the Arctic. Needing to cool off, he inched toward the dessert. It was tall, multi-tiered, and freezing cold, to the touch some fancy layered ice cream cake. He pressed a paw against the side and immediately melted a perfect bear print in the frosting. Oops. He quickly licked his paw, taking some of the frosting with it. The burst of sugar was overwhelming, so different from the fatty seal or fresh fish he was used to. But any cold treat was welcome in this sweltering climate. He looked over his shoulder to see if anyone was watching. It seemed a couple of kids were in the midst of bickering over who would blow out the candles, so no one had eyes on him. Emboldened, he pressed his nose directly to the cake, slurping a large chunk out of the side. The combinations of vanilla, chocolate, and the subtlest bite of strawberry led him to devour it with surprising gusto. The more he ate, the cooler he felt. By the time the exasperated mother came near, half the cake was gone, and so was most of the polar bear's illusions of stealth. The woman shrieked, though whether from fear or anger, it was hard to say. She definitely wasn't praising him for the costume. Frosting coated his muzzle in thick white swirls. The mother sputtered, what my cake?" Meanwhile, the kids squealed in delight, thoroughly amused. One bold child started chanting, "Polar bear, polar bear!" Soon enough, the entire group joined in, either in excitement or in an adrenaline-fueled mania of the moment. Sensing that his welcome had worn out, he turned tail and awkwardly scampered away, clinging to the remains of his board shorts, which threatened to slide off. He made a dignified exit, at least as dignified as a giant polar bear in a bright fish print bathing suit can manage. Luckily, no one chased him, presumably still trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Bad manners or not, he couldn't bring himself to regret the cake. It had been too delicious to regret. Word of a theming genius in an incredible polar bear costume began circulating up and down the beach, leading to more invitations, whether direct or accidental. Over the next few days, our furry friend hopped from party to party with more confidence than ever. He discovered that certain gatherings were downright perfect for him. The ones near big freezers or coolers stuffed with ice were top favorites. On one occasion, he found himself inside a beachside bar, nuzzling open a cooler behind the counter to lounge in a bath of ice cubes. The bartender nearly fainted when he discovered him, but the regular patrons just roared with laughter, some filming the encounter on their phones. They evidently decided it was a comedic stunt. One offered him a popsicle, which he licked contentedly. Another time, he wandered into a surf competition after-party. The surfers, exhausted but cheerful, initially treated him with wary amusement. He made fast friends by distributing their leftover ice packs. He simply grabbed a few in his jaws and brought them over to the surfers, complaining of sore shoulders. They laughed, patted his head, and even tried to introduce him to their surfboards. Curiosity piqued, the polar bear attempted to paddle out on a longboard, only to wobble dangerously before belly-flopping into the water. The spectators cracked up at the sight of a giant polar bear flailing among the waves. Still, he discovered that the ocean water, at least this distance from the shoreline, was considerably cooler and quite refreshing once he got the hang of floating on his back. As he drifted and let the waves rock him, he wondered if maybe tropical beaches had their perks after all. His escapades were soon the talk of the scene. People claimed to see him everywhere, from a jam-packed beach rave to a quiet bonfire gathering. Some insisted he was part of a viral marketing campaign for a new soda brand or nature documentary. A few outraged beachgoers lodged complaints with the local authorities, demanding that the man in the bear costume be forced to leave them in peace. The polar bear remained blissfully unaware of the controversies swirling around him. For the most part, people were kind, offering him cold drinks, rubbing his belly if he allowed it, and occasionally letting him lounge in shaded cabanas. But not everyone was so warm and fuzzy about his presence. One day, as he was dozing beneath a large umbrella at a corporate event, sipping from a comically small coconut shell, he noticed a couple of grim-faced park rangers approaching. They wore matching khaki uniforms, wide-brimmed hats, and determined scowls that didn't bode well. "Sir," one ranger addressed the polar bear, "we've had several reports of dangerous wildlife on the beach." The bear blinked in mild confusion, forgetting momentarily that he was posing as a man in a bear suit. Still, maybe he could keep up appearances. He stood and tried to bow, hoping to seem polite. The other ranger frowned. "I'm afraid we can't allow your costume to remain if you're endangering the public. There have been incidents." The polar bear coughed out a low growl of protest. He wanted to communicate that he wasn't hurting anyone. On the contrary, he'd been the life of the party. But one of the rangers yelped in alarm at the guttural sound. "That's enough," the first ranger intoned, stepping bravely or foolishly forward. "Please remove the costume's head so we can speak to you properly." The polar bear began to panic. Remove his head? That wasn't exactly possible. He tried shaking his head no, the hat slipping sideways. The rangers exchanged suspicious glances. Something in the polar bear's eyes made them realize this might not be a costume after all. "Oh my gosh," the second ranger breathed, stepping back. "This is an actual polar bear." The polar bear licked the coconut's remaining juice in an effort to remain nonchalant. The rangers scrambled back, shouting for backup. Startled, he decided it was time for a quick exit. Overturning a beach umbrella and scattering a stack of empty chairs, he lumbered away from the corporate event, his board shorts flapping as he ran. Word spread quickly. There was a real polar bear roaming the beach. The question was, why wasn't it attacking people or causing major havoc? For every concerned or panicked onlooker, there were others who insisted the bear was harmless. Photos and videos popped up on social media, mostly showing a docile giant wearing silly hats, dancing awkwardly, or floating lazily on an inflatable raft. It became a viral sensation. Some folks joked that the bear was on vacation, complete with comedic memes of him sipping tropical drinks with little umbrellas. Others demanded authorities relocate him for his own safety, pointing out that a polar bear really didn't belong in the tropics. The polar bear, meanwhile, found that crashing parties had grown more difficult. The element of surprise was gone, people anticipated him. On the plus side, many of them wanted to see him up close and invited him. But along with the new invites came crowds, cameras, and curious children wanting to climb on him. It was more attention than he'd ever known. The novelty soon wore off. He longed for the quiet splendor of the Arctic, where he could pad across miles of white tundra without encountering a single human. As much as he appreciated the free fruit punch, was this truly where he belonged? One day, as he wandered near the pier, he saw a large yacht anchored in a private slip, blasting music loud enough to rattle the boards. Another party, no surprise there, but then he caught sight of something glorious. A massive ice sculpture, shaped like a leaping dolphin perched on the yacht's upper deck. The bear's eyes lit up. Ice. Beautiful, glistening, magnificent ice that called to his very soul. With renewed energy, he toppled the pier's safety ring and lunged across the gangplank. A few yelps sounded from the yacht's guests, but he ignored them. He dashed straight for the sculpture, ignoring the lavish buffet, the swanky bar, and the startled VIP decked out in a gold chain. With a single swipe, he slammed his paw against the sculpture. The crisp coldness seeped into his pads, lighting up every nerve with relief. Yes, this was what he needed. He hugged the sculpture, pressing his cheek against the slick surface. Chunks of ice began melting on contact, but it felt amazing while it lasted. The price of such a moment was more commotion, as the horrified party guests realized an actual polar bear was climbing on their precious decor. They screamed, scattered, and dialed for help, or for the paparazzi. It was hard to tell. The polar bear closed his eyes for a blissful second. This was it. This was the best feeling he'd had since he'd splashed off the bus that had brought him to the beach weeks ago. If only he could take some of this ice with him and find a nice quiet freezer somewhere. He was so lost in that thought, in his sheer longing for a colder environment, that he didn't initially notice a figure approaching. When he opened his eyes, he saw another animal, a big brown dog probably belonging to one of the yacht's guests, timidly sniffing at the giant white visitor. The bear expected the dog to bark or run away. Instead, it wagged its tail uncertainly. The bear gave it a pleasant grunt in response, and the dog inched closer, also drawn to the dripping ice sculpture. Suddenly, the music cut out. Over loudspeakers, an authoritative voice boomed. "Attention, polar bear, we have contacted wildlife services. Please remain calm." The absurdity made the polar bear huff. Remain calm? All he wanted was this ice. But staying put wasn't exactly an option, with a flurry of onlookers gaping from the dock, phones lifted, sirens approaching in the distance. The dog whimpered. The polar bear gently nudged it aside, looked sorrowfully at the partially melted sculpture, and decided to make one final dash for freedom. Bounding off the yacht, he plowed through startled paparazzi. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment the polar bear soared off the edge of the dock and belly flopped into the ocean. A cheer rose from the crowd, partly out of excitement and partly out of relief that he was leaving. He swam with powerful strokes, not sure where he was headed, just away from the chaos and noise. And from the authorities, who likely intended to confine him somewhere he couldn't party crash or enjoy free punch whenever he pleased. He paddled along the coastline until the sun began to set, painting the horizon in shades of pink and orange. He was exhausted, overheated, and uncertain. The swirling water felt warmer than he liked, but it was far better than toasting on the beach. Eventually, he spotted a rocky outcrop rising above the surf, secluded enough to let him rest without being gawked at. He scrambled onto the rocks, dripping salty water, letting the last rays of sunlight dance across his wet fur. As he gazed at the horizon, he couldn't help but feel a pang of conflict. The tropical beaches had been a ridiculous adventure. He had discovered fruit punch, ice cream cake, dancing, and the comedic bliss of disguising himself as a man in a polar bear suit. He had found fleeting pockets of coolness and comfort, but deep down he knew this wasn't home. Perhaps it was time to move on. Maybe find a cargo ship heading north, back to the icy tundra that had once been his domain. At that thought, he glanced over his shoulder, imagining the faint sounds of music drifting from the beach parties. Maybe one day, he would return for another crazy escapade. After all, the polar party crashing had been a riot, hadn't it? He snorted with amusement, remembering the moment the child hugged him amid a crowd of speechless adults, remembering the glorious tower of ice cream cake and the kindly folks who had given him a popsicle. For a polar bear, life in a tropical paradise was hot, chaotic, and filled with surprises, but it had also been more fun than he could ever have expected. And so, with a final huff, saturated in lingering laughter, he closed his eyes, letting the cool coastal breeze ruffle his fur. Tomorrow, he might set paw on a new journey, maybe stow away on a chilly container ship or scope out an air-conditioned resort. For one last evening, though, a deserted rocky nook beside the gently rolling waves would have to do. No parties, no disguises, just the rustle of the wind and the soft hush of the sea. He thought about the fruit punch, the silly hats, and the mesmerizing swirl of disco lights. A rumbling chuckle escaped his throat. If there was ever a need to crash a beach party again, well, he knew he'd still be the best polar bear for the job.